I want to thank Gail and Ed and Carl and many friends that are here. Thank you all for inviting me to speak today. And I really appreciate not only the work that the Center for Built Environment has done, but also the partnerships across campus that it's built. When I first arrived at Berkeley in 1998, quite a while ago now, CBE is one of our biggest partners, and we've seen joint students, joint projects. I'll mention briefly, but I'm hoping other people will mention the Eco Block. There's a number of sustainability, justice-focused efforts that I'll try to do a little bit of justice to today, in just kind of highlighting some of the connectivity. And this is a bit of an intimidating audience for me in the sense that you guys know a lot and do a lot. And sometimes on the academic side, we claim to know a lot, but don't do a lot. And so one of the issues I'm hoping we'll get some dialogue at the end is really some of the opportunities to move things more aggressively forward. And while I know not all of us use Twitter, X, whatever it's called anymore, the Twitter handle there, I think we're also on that Mastodon thing, but I can never quite figure it out. We try to do about one tweet, or the so-called tweets, I'm not sure, a day about the work in the lab. And the lab is called RAIL, the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. Well, let's not worry about the pointer. But we try to kind of have a researcher to quite practitioner activist side of the operations. And I'll illustrate a couple of those things as we go through to kind of highlight where not only do I feel or see that we have real opportunities to make accelerated progress, but also some of the areas where we're clearly lagging. And of course, the built environment with its long lifetime is both a huge opportunity and a big challenge. And I'll try to illustrate that in a couple ways. So even in California, I feel like we have to start with the obligatory climate slide. Of course, this is all second nature to you all. Some of you have it tattooed, here or somewhere else. But one of the features that still remains critical to keep recognizing is that if we take an optimistic view of all of the global agreements that have been signed, that would put us essentially in either the top light blue band, getting to just about a little bit under 3 degrees Celsius. Some people think we're on path for much more. If we look at some of the near-term objectives, and there have been some with the COP meeting coming up in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it's a very odd year with COP coming mid-November due to Eid. And of course, having COP in Baku, arguably the world's oldest oil and gas city, doesn't have the irony is not lost. But if we look at an optimistic view of all of the commitments that are made, and of course, most commitments, at least in the US, we tend to make commitments not to meet them, but to mobilize discussion. Whereas in China, they actually only commit to things when they're confident they can get there. I'll come back to that little interesting difference a little bit later on. But we have a series of goals and objectives that we're aiming for, and almost certainly we won't meet them. That does tend to be the way, but recognizing that the Nobel Prize that Gail talked about was for the work of the IPCC. There's lots of room for disagreement about different parts, but what it says is that we need to be carbon neutral by mid-century. Mid-century being kind of the euphemism for the error bars between Sweden's 2035 target, California's currently vastly insufficient 2045 target, China, Nigeria, South Africa 2060, India I think is still 2070, but some of these things are murky. Those are not acceptable targets, but the only way to advance that is not just to do more analysis, more PowerPoint, but to find ways to put it into action. That pathway, the green pathway there, is the 1.5 degrees C compliant pathway. That's the Paris Climate Accords. That says that we need to zero carbon emissions or net carbon emissions, and then go negative to make up for our frivolous ways without seeing the kind of forest fires in California, in Siberia, in Australia becoming like the new normal, right? We have created a 5th season of the year unequivocally. We used to have winter, summer, spring, and fall. Now we have those 4 plus fire season, and that is our creation, our gift to the planet. And we have already warmed the planet definitively by 1.2. So the headroom is 0.3 degrees Celsius. That is ridiculously small. We have some places like California talking a good game and maybe being on or maybe not on path. places like China building in a massive amount of renewable energy. That's amazing. But at the same time, also building huge numbers of new coal plants as part of their COVID response strategy. So we are all hypocrites in our own way, public or private. So we need to find a way to really honor and take advantage of what the IPCC analysis tells us, and to be able to translate the slide that we all see, but I would argue we all ignore, and that is when you look at the difference between what 1.5 and 2 degrees would do, it's not exactly the same for each individual category: extreme heat, coral bleaching, forest loss, et cetera, but more or less everything doubles in severity if we don't meet the 1.5 and we're instead on pace for 2. And a lot of you will say, why are you talking about 1.5 and 2? We're actually really on pace for 3 or higher. So you can have your own private or public demons about that in a bit. But I just want to highlight, we are already seeing this. The climate crisis is certainly not something theoretical or in a distance. New York City on May 5th, before the fires in Ontario and Quebec, turned New York City into a worse version of the worst of the 2 Blade Runner movies, the Blade Runner 2049. New York City is arguably worse than that LA vision. So we have a horrific built landscape story in our future if we don't find a way to make these goals far more real. And if I haven't depressed you enough, let me turn to the non-climate part of that equation, and that is we have 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and for the experts in the room, that's 169 sub-goals, and they're all wonderful. Let's protect biodiversity. Let's provide energy access to the roughly 800 million people without. Let's aim for gender equity in terms of educational outcomes. These are all excellent features, but when we actually look at the numbers, we are not on target or recessing on most all of them. So this is a climate and a development, social justice, integration disaster. And some of us who are elder will write about it, talk about it, but the younger ones in the audience will be living it. This is our gift to you. So the other feature that we probably don't really need to go into, but it's just kind of nice to highlight, that there's probably no place in the US that has had a more interesting, not always entirely positive, but a really interesting, nuanced, deep, and impactful interaction on the overall process. My predecessor in the Energy and Resources Group, John Holdren, was the longest serving science advisor to a president in US history. We've had a Rosenfeld and kind of the father, grandfather, whatever, of energy efficiency. Bob Bullard, who wrote the classic Dumping in Dixie, wrote it while a visiting scholar at Berkeley in the Energy and Resources Group. M. King Hubbard and the Hubbard curves was here. Wangari Maathai has been a visitor, first African Nobel laureate. A whole variety of really interesting pieces. Mary Nichols, Fran Pavley, kind of more and less known absolute heroes of the planet in this process. We've had governors who, on other states, you can't tell who's a Democrat, who's a Republican. We have there Brown and Schwarzenegger together, each having had their interesting impacts. Many positive and then some other features. But it's that landscape that is really going to be the core piece of this talk. And it's really that Berkeley has to remain what I think the best way to describe us, we are the anti-Las Vegas, right? What starts here does not end here. And I guess if anything, I would want to highlight, it's kind of a sad day of passing with Sim van der Ende having just passed, kind of a monumental figure in being able to think about the science, the engineering, the design, and the practice of getting these things done. So it's a remarkable place, and we kind of owe it to that legacy to find ways to not just write cool papers, but to accelerate. So in my own case, it's been a fun back and forth. What I've tried to do is really live off the back of super talented students, but have footprints in kind of the 3 areas. And so the companies that I've either worked very, very closely with inside or helped to found or listed in the middle. Some kind of famous ones, Enphase, Grid Alternatives. Some less known ones, Nline is a Berkeley spin-out grid monitoring company where we can do outages, SAIDI, and SAIFI and various features. And we use these kinds of sensors in smart building applications everywhere, from dense networks of them in places that you all have seen, downtown Oakland, to places that I hope some of you have seen, and I hope some of you will attend the remarkable event Friday. We have the record now of having installed the most smart sensors in the Congo, and there'll be a major Congo justice event on campus this Friday. My work is focused in North Kivu, where Goma is, and so some really interesting partnerships, and it brings in Virunga Power, a clean energy spin out of Africa's oldest national park. So a whole bunch of kind of interesting ways to translate some of the work that we do analytically with nonprofit groups, with our students, into efforts that not only allow us to think about analytics. We do a lot of modeling of energy systems, as Gail mentioned, and I'll briefly touch on that. But then a whole bunch of NGO groups that we work with as well to try to put some of these projects and actions into place. And at least for me, I think the biggest change in thinking in the quarter century that I've been at Berkeley is not the fact that years that we used to model in the future have now suddenly arrived. It's actually quite scary, because I used to do lots of modeling work for 2025. Suddenly, that's not so interesting anymore. But also the fact that Berkeley was one of, if not the critical university to pioneer system-wide the integration of environmental justice into this equation. And the motivations for that are many. One of the most critical ones is that if we look at the carbon footprint, the greenhouse gas impact of the richest 1% or 10% of the world, that's over half of the world's greenhouse gas emissions directly attributable to the affluent, and most of us in this room are going to qualify in that group, whereas the poorest half of the planet are under 10% of emissions. So the injustice, the inequality is massive. And any of you who drive downtown Oakland and go past the endowment building will see the huge flyer on the wall highlighting that one Hamming distance difference in postal code. I live in 94611, 94621, a full 10-year difference in life expectancy. That's not all climate. There's a whole variety of features, but that is about as stark as you can get in terms of a inequality and injustice that intentionally or not, we have foisted on the process. At the very end of the talk, I want to highlight an area that I'm exceedingly proud of, and it's the degree to which Berkeley has really leaned in a way that I have never seen before. Berkeley launched a cluster hire in environmental justice. There's people in CED, in ERG, in engineering, in economics, all who have been hired as a cluster in environmental justice. Rachel Morello-Frosch, who is half in public health and half in ESPM, and I co-chair this group. We hired 5 faculty directly with another hire in progress, but now there's about 20 faculty on campus who have accreted into this justice cluster and are hopefully going to be one of the kind of signposts for Berkeley engaging in this in a really active way. I was at another university recently that I won't mention, Harvard, and they said they will not even try to compete with Berkeley in terms of having a diverse and a multifaceted engagement with hiring faculty and bringing on students that make this justice equation critical to climate change, so that we can legitimately say we can't solve climate without centering justice, and we cannot address inequality without recognizing the climate story. So that really is the piece. So I want to do one other piece of review, and it's something that hopefully everyone knows and has kind of different narratives and perspectives on, but I think it's one that illustrates kind of the evolution, and I would argue the US or the California way to make policy, as imperfect as it is, and that is the story around California's renewable energy standards, which arguably the RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standard process, not the European feed-in tariff version, but the RPS, the early US model, was actually created largely by Nancy Rader and Dick Norgard on campus here at Berkeley. And that evolved through its various versions, AB 32 and then now SB 32. But our learning process has some interesting features. So California's first statewide clean energy standard beyond the RPSs was to be 20% powered by renewables in 2010. A target we missed. There was actually a small pseudo mock celebration in Sacramento at the time, but California missing its 2010 target to be 20% powered by renewables. We met our 2020 target of 1/3 powered by renewables 3.5 years early. So that was a busy block of years. And it was largely because there was so much inertia against, and whether you want to blame the PUCs or certain utilities or certain executives or whatever, there's lots of interesting blame to go around. But it was discovered that, hey, just installing renewables for all of the challenges is a lot easier than installing large amounts of new fossil power. And so California was able to jump to that target. The 2030 target was 50% renewables. That target has now been up to 60%. And as I'll get to in a little bit, California just went through a period of time where for 100 days straight, us as the world's 4th largest economy exported green power every single day. Some days for only a couple minutes, some days for longer. But as the 4th largest economy, any Germans in the room, I understand we may flip-flop back after some post-Soviet invasion issues get resolved. But right now, we're the 4th largest economy, and that's a remarkable point to be at. That story is interesting. A lot of people in the room have played a key hand in that. There's a lot of elements to that effort, but one that does not get enough attention in terms of how transformative mentally it was the fact that as we launched the cap and trade system, and remember, actually, Governor Schwarzenegger asked us who were on the commission not to do cap and trade. He asked us to do cap and dividend. That did not get through the legislature. Cap and trade did. But 35% of cap and trade revenues are reserved for low-income, fence-line, marginalized communities. And that would, to me, be the perfect example of California, the anti-Las Vegas, because what it meant was that our built infrastructure around renewables generated this surge in clean energy production. A lot more is needed, but it also set up what I'll call Justice 35, California's commitment, which then candidate for president, Vice President Biden, then came, visited, talked with the governor and said, I can do you 5 better. Justice 40, the largest single block of money in the Inflation Reduction Act, roughly $60 billion, is earmarked for justice-focused projects nationwide. And one of the other mechanisms that I hope will be a key feature of the Harris administration is working very hard on Inflation Reduction Act 2 that will integrate in another Berkeley innovation, and that is the social cost of carbon. So there's an interesting and kind of complicated story in this piece overall, and a feature of this process that even those of us who are jaded about solar, its challenges, its benefits, need to remember is that we consistently underestimate, right? And there's quotes from Mark Twain and various futurists, all basically versions of, you cannot convince someone of something, even if it's true, if it might affect them financially in a negative way. So one aspect of that is if you look at the forecast year after year in yellow for where solar was going to be, well, reality of solar has vastly eclipsed. There are apology emails posted on the Bill's notes saying, oh, I guess I got solar wrong. I haven't noticed them then giving back and kind of finding a way to make up for that. But it has consistently outperformed what we've said because of the kind of speed and scale issues that Tom Steyer and others like to highlight. It's faster to install. We have a challenge of greening the materials and recycling, which I'll get to briefly later on. But there are learning mechanisms in going green that if you're just an academic or you're just in industry or you're just in government, you are not likely to see. The co-benefits span across areas. The fact that we're now talking about opportunities to mirror what's happened in residential homes. I worked very hard on the ruling that every home built in California after 2020 had to have solar, and I was told by many, many experts that was a stupid goal. That would be too difficult, too expensive, blah, blah, blah. It happened basically without a ripple. some of you may know and some of you may have strong opinions about the unfunded mandate, and that is, in theory, the same work that Diane Gurnich did when she was at the PUC with others, was that in theory, California has said that every commercial building is supposed to be net zero by 2030. And that one is something that was on paper at one point. A lot of people are ignoring it. I don't see any reason why, with advances in storage, advances in transparent solar, some of the really smart systems, we could not get that back on the table. That would only happen if this kind of group makes it happen, because it is written, but it is certainly not something that you hear being pushed forward. And I think a lot of people would just be happy if it kind of just drifted back. This is great. This is kind of the solar infrastructure version, but we also know that just new cool technology without a deeper attention on the social side does not get us where we need to go. A couple of years ago, with two former postdocs, now faculty, one at Tufts, one at University of Texas, Austin, we worked with Google to use their Google sunroof data with a lot of machine learning, a bunch of AI, to examine all the solar rooftop across the United States. And remember SB1 in California, when we originally said we should do 1 million solar roofs, other people said that was impossible, as they said was impossible in electric vehicles. Both targets happened, one ahead of schedule, one right a little bit behind, but you can do some remarkable things. But if we don't take this solar story and accelerate the thinking around justice, we, no surprise, have wonderful tech for the rich and the same old for the poor. So what we did with Google was to do some deep analysis at the census tract level across the country. And what you find is that across an order of magnitude of income from people at the poverty level, it's a whole nother issue, embarrassment for a country like the United States. But what we find from the poverty line up to $250,000 income, if you are in a white majority neighborhood, solar is 30 to 50% more likely to be present on your roof. If you're in a community with primarily meaning 51% or more African American, solar is 50 to 70% less likely. A Latinx community, 35 to 55% less likely across that entire order of magnitude income range. So without social justice, without social science, humanities, thinking around how do we redesign policies, advances on the hardware side do not get us where we need to go. For this audience, I'm not going to go through the details of the learning curve. I'm assuming those of you that don't have the climate tattoo somewhere have this tattoo somewhere else on your body, right? And of course, the learning curve for solar, it's not unique to solar. This is the same exact thing for energy storage. And so banking on both the technological evolution through just-in-time manufacturing, through innovations in production and other technologies, and in a market push, is the critical piece of the story that ultimately is going to lead us back to not only lower cost technologies to go into buildings, but ultimately, I think this is actually the technical underpinning of a solution where the US and China can find a way to make real what I'll get to at the end, which is the Sunny Lands Agreement. And that is, we have committed on paper to triple the amount of renewable energy worldwide by 2030. China's on pace, we're not. I'll come back to that story in a little bit. But what I want to highlight on is just how quickly things can change and just how quickly experts, non-experts who said something is not possible have to change their tune, and how quickly people are good, unfortunately, at kind of disguising their prior slowness of thought. So California, this is a nice New York Times summary piece highlighting where we were in terms of solar in California long ago in 2021, where we were just beginning to get through these roles of getting more and more renewables on board. We are now at a point, as reported in 2022 by Bloomberg New Energy Finance and others, that it is now cheaper almost everywhere to install new renewable energy than it is to operate existing fossil power plants. And the number of utility CEOs and others, I don't want to call anybody out, who have seen these numbers and and insist on denying it are remarkably high, but what's happening in California and now Texas that's overtaking us is pretty remarkable, right? With the deployment of energy storage, both some large centralized plants, Moss Energy Facility, for example, and a lot of distributed storage, we have now added these wings because I heard solar is not available at nighttime. We'll get to space-based solar maybe later on, but this process of pushing down the learning curve and thinking about built structures that take advantage of low-cost clean energy and enough storage so that 24/7 baseload renewables is not something that looks like a fiction. And certainly when I came to campus, there were lots and lots of very well-educated researchers, practitioners who said just not going to happen. And now we're at a point where it will only not happen if we choose to make it not happen. Doesn't mean that solves itself. We are doing huge damage to the solar industry with the ridiculous process around NEM 2.0, NEM 2.x. But we have the opportunities now to do things really differently, and it allows us to think very differently about the process. And so some of the fun of working in California on the built environment is to recognize how tightly we can see these things that are linked, right? So right now, as you all know, we live in a place where students can't afford to live near campus, where low-income individuals have to commute routinely an hour a day each way. The kind of drive till you qualify or till you can afford housing is why Scott Wiener and I wrote a piece that has gotten me more hate mail from rich white suburbanites than anything else I could have written, I guess, highlighting the degree to which if we don't build and plan for infill just housing, the kind of thing that's supposed to be happening, and it's happening a little bit near BART stops, but we could do much more broadly. These are critical steps of transforming not only our built environment story, rent-controlled housing, investing in transit-smart, walkable spaces, but also as a way to solve our massive transportation problem. And the work with Lyft and now Uber, both of which have said all their vehicles will be electric by a certain date, which is, of course, ironic because they're still denying that their employees are their employees. But we'll leave that for other people on campus to sort out. These are all opportunities to think incredibly differently. So I want to highlight two more kind of cases, one of which there will certainly be disagreement on the room, and that is the infamous duck curve. And I won't detail it. I think everyone has seen versions of it. To me, the duck curve was like a massive success story. One of my former students is the vice president of PG&E right now. She may think a little differently about that. But I view this as the absolute triumph of deploying more and more renewables. But I guess your policy on clean energy is a function of where you stand as a function of where you sit. And by building more and more renewables, the marginal value of adding more, in particular solar, has gone down. And that may be true if your worldview is, let's embrace myopia. But the anti that view is, well, if we, instead of what almost everyone at almost every transportation research center was doing 20 years ago, and that was saying, let's charge up our electric vehicles at night, and let's have orderly charging where the charging swaps between vehicles and they're all parked. In fact, what we now know is that encouraging daytime charging and vehicle-to-grid two-way connectivity allows us to build new markets for clean energy, in particular solar, but it applies to others as well. Of course, California is not an ideal wind state because our wind has an odd daily pattern. It's perfect for Midwestern states. But not only valuing that clean energy with something that I would argue gets us towards the social cost of carbon, the technology to make vehicles two-way is not that difficult. 10 years ago, people thought it really was hard. And now it also allows us to think about transitioning much more rapidly from gray hydrogen to green hydrogen because we can produce it when it's available. If California gets anywhere near its 25 gigawatt plan of offshore wind, which of course we're not exactly on schedule to get right now, markets like green hydrogen are going to be critical. And right now, opinions are massively varied on hydrogen. I am still waiting to be convinced there is an absolute killer use case for hydrogen. I don't want it to slide into the world where nuclear is, it's the solution for everything until you dig into the numbers. And we just saw Google has just now purchased 5 gigawatts of small modular reactors. There's some real design challenges coming our way, but it's a really interesting version. And I'll conclude, I think I'm probably getting close to my clock time with you. I need to check. I can't remember exactly. Okay, you're not checking. Okay, but I want to highlight, if I can run it properly, kind of an example of learning and doing, and it requires some interesting partnerships. So my lab was asked about 12 years ago to develop a series of models for the mayor of New York to think about electrifying vehicles. And so what better use of kind of our agent-based and cellular automaton models. So we modeled every taxi cab in New York City. This is now work we did 11 years ago. And so every red dot is a taxi with a rider. Every blue dot is one looking for a rider, and green are charging locations. And so we did this simulation, not real data, starting at midnight, you'll notice. And so there's some, because the city never sleeps, you can see Central Park if you look closely. The green shows up well here, not so well there. Up in the Bronx, the vehicles are charging. Now we're hitting rush hour. It's now, and you'll see a flood of blue dots down in Manhattan. They go and find their riders, but they don't want to drive back to the Bronx, low income. And so what you see is charging locations appear in lower and central Manhattan to minimize drive times and to minimize wait times to recharge. I'm going to show that again because this is just, I find this so much fun. This was a PhD of someone named Gordon Bauer, now working at a EV company. And so again, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., now you see the flood of empty taxis coming into Manhattan. So very cool. And we thought by doing the analysis, the mayor is going to work with the taxi companies. But we started to get long discussions. Taxi companies are too powerful, too corrupt. We're not going to be able to work with them. One of my grad students said, Dan, you're just not making any progress with the mayor's office. Why don't you go somewhere where they actually think technocrats should be in charge? And so that student was from Chengdu, but living in Shenzhen. He said, come to Shenzhen. In 12 months, Shenzhen didn't even require us to rerun that model. We thought we were going to have to build it out for Shenzhen. Shenzhen is kind of prides itself as being the city of the future, also the home of BYD. And so they may have a gender issue in terms of taxi drivers, but they replaced 21,000 taxis with EV taxis in 1 year. I don't know where the old taxis went. I'm not sure I want to know. But this was an overnight success. The mayor loved it. The Secretary of Transportation for the city became the vice mayor because of this project. He was very pleased with us. And of course, it generated a problem. And that was that the taxis that were built by BYD for the city were all the same model. They all had the same battery size. And Shenzhen had all taxi drivers change shift at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. 12-hour shifts is pretty brutal. But what it meant was that the requirement was you have to give your taxi to the next driver fully charged. That meant long queues of taxis. You could only see one empty space in what was at the time the world's largest EV charging bay at the train station, 637 total charging stations. And Shenzhen said, well, you helped us on this, but you blanked us over in terms of these long charging queues. And here's the data. The larger and darker the circles on the left here show the wait times. And so what do you do if you're at a Silicon Valley related university with smart grad students? Of course, you have a problem like that. You used to do analysis. Now what you do is you build an app, right? So we built an app, and basically it rewarded taxi drivers for arriving at their scheduled recharge time, and it penalized them if they arrived late. And we were able, within a week, to cut the wait time by 20%. It has been a really interesting process. It's moved forward, so much so that the company that used to be Chengdu-based, now is Shenzhen-based, was just given the contract in both Buenos Aires, and this is the data for Chengdu, to integrate electric vehicles, taxis, electric-powered mass transit, and e-bikes all into a network with kind of a green, easy button, if you remember the Super Bowl commercials, to kind of put all of this together in a package to bring essentially together all of these aspects. That's something that is not exactly something we can do very easily in the US. It does leave critical next projects. I hope some of you have seen this kind of scary picture, because as we try to accelerate these features, we also know that there is a looming, it's here arguably, materials science and recycling issue for what goes into into our materials. So here's the periodic table colored in by materials that are in your phone and the recycling rates. So I am hopeful that Berkeley will be one of the first universities to launch a new department, whether it's in engineering or not, I don't know, around materials, circularity, sustainability, because we are clearly going to need a massive new set of thinking. Is redwood materials our only big recycling? I wouldn't even call it a success story yet, but we're going to have to dramatically change our thinking, because the growth rate in use of lithium and cobalt and all kinds of materials is forecast to be massive. Now, one of my projects is actually working with a Vietnamese, a Chinese, and a German auto manufacturer to accelerate the movement from lithium-ion batteries to lithium phosphate batteries. Lithium phosphate does not need cobalt. That's great. That means some of this illegal, artisanal, very dangerous child labor mining, 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the Congo. But the challenge is to not do what certain companies have done, I won't mention those by name, who have said, we're going to green our supply chain by simply leaving the places where it's complicated, right? Leaving the Congos, the Afghanistans, the Nicaraguas of the world, because you can get cleaner materials elsewhere, is not a solution to the process. What we're going to really have to do is to find ways to lean in and meaningfully invest in places that we were marginalizing before. So my last couple minutes will be just highlighting a project that I got to launch at USAID when I was there 2 years ago, and they very kindly allowed me to take with me back to Berkeley. So this is a map of the grid in Africa today, the black lines. And some people think those dots are green. Some people think they're blue. I actually can't tell. To me, who thinks those are green? Who thinks they're blue? That was anemic on both sides, so I don't know what the answer is. Anyway, the dots are health clinics, from the biggest tertiary hospitals to the smallest off-grid clinics in Africa. It's about 170,000 health clinics across the continent, and about 100,000 either don't have power at all, don't have affordable, or don't have regular power. And what that means is that even if UNICEF or Red Cross or Green Crescent donates or provides medical equipment, you probably can't run it. And voltage frequency variations absolutely kill off hardware equipment. So what we were able to put together was a global consortium. You see some of the standard actors, some of the big foundations, UN agencies, big companies. Our lab at Berkeley and Arizona State are two, there are some others now, partners in an effort to monitor power quality, to help with the installation of hardware, and to work in countries that join this alliance. And the ticket to join the alliance is that the global community is working to access either as donations or as low cost the CapEx to provide solar systems at clinics. But the countries need to work for the public health clinics to cover the OpEx. Generally, that's by simply the savings on diesel, but it can also be for overbuilding the grids so they can provide local service, the so-called mini grids. And so a process of kind of design, going into containerized solutions. This is a mini grid in a box for a health clinic. You deliver it, solar, the power conditioners, the batteries are inside the box at different sizes. This is examples in Eswatini of small and larger health clinics, telemedicine, using advanced metering technologies, all put together to try to increase the sustainability of clinics. And we have currently several thousand of these in phase 1 of the effort. And just kind of to highlight how significant it can be, this is one particular hospital in Goma in eastern DRC. This is currently the largest mini grid, at least that I know of in Africa. There may be some bigger ones at mining operations. They're not on grid. But what you see here is the variation in voltage. Over here on the left, when being run by the prior diesel generator. When we installed solar, the first solar installed was just phase one. It's the panels here, the 800 kilowatts on this left side of the road. And you can see the power quality went immediately to flat and reliable. It was so successful, the city and a private group expanded it to 5 megawatts of power. And so now we have an example where this mini grid powers the hospital, it powers schools, it now sells power at low cost to the community. So it's an example of kind of one of our best success stories, but we have several thousand of these cases in place right now. Let me conclude with jumping back up to the larger scale and just to highlight how much of a challenge we have to go. And I mentioned the Sunnylands Agreement. So in November 2023, the research teams, the research, the analytic teams, both in the White House and in Beijing. This was run by John Kerry, the so-called SPEC at the time, the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, worked closely with his Chinese counterparts to craft an agreement. And they found the perfect name. I don't know how they found this place called Sunnylands in California. I don't even know where Sunnylands is. But what better place to have the agreement get orchestrated? And the Sunnylands Agreement was for the US and China to work together to triple the amount of renewable energy in use by 2030. Not very far away. So here we have the graph of past performance. China is in red, we are in orange, Europe is in this purple color here. And while we're very proud of the fact that you look online, you'll see 90% of new energy capacity in 2023 and 2022 is renewables. That's great, giving us this nice exponential curve. We used to love exponentials, kind of the Club of Rome days, but we are forecast to miss that 2030 target by the size, it's going by itself here, by the size of that green bar. So we will miss by an amount of energy equal, almost exactly, eerily exactly, to the total amount of renewables installed today. So 5 years, not a lot of time on these curves, and we are off. Now, I mentioned policy making as a critical part of the story. Again, Presidents Xi and Biden signed this agreement. We know there are some certain not insignificant tensions, but I think it's pretty clear China will not meet its climate goals without us. We will not meet our climate goals without them. And true to form, China is actually on pace to triple the amount of renewables. So at one level, they win the Sunnylands game. The US is not on pace to meet their goals, neither is Europe or Africa or elsewhere. But it's a little more nuanced than that. China will meet its renewable goals, but it's also the world's largest installer of new fossil power plants. And that has to stop now. They need us to get off of that. We are not on pace, and we all know about the trade wars around batteries and solar panels. So we need them, and they need us. And the global community needs these kinds of lessons to permeate the built environment structures worldwide. And so I work in Africa and in the US, and so I'm hoping we will be part of that, and I'm hoping that all of you will do the same. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it, and have a great meeting.